Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mountain Lake Journal. I'm Thom Hallock. 3 years ago, Tom Little, an eye doctor from Albany, was part of a group of 10 humanitarian aid workers killed in Afghanistan. Long before the U.S. and Russian invasions brought worldwide attention, Tom Little had spent most of his life and career there, making it his mission to provide eye care to Afghans in need. He fell in love with the country and the people. He was known in humanitarian circles around the world, and after his death, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But beyond the wars and his murder at the hands of the Taliban is a remarkable story, a legacy that can be seen in a new hospital wing named in his honor, and even after American troops leave, the people of this war-torn country will have access to quality eye care, thanks to the man they knew as Dr. Thom. Dan Swinton from Plattsburgh is the producer of that documentary. He is also the director of content here at Mountain Lake PBS. Nice to have you. You traveled a few months ago with Tom Little's wife, Libby, back to Afghanistan on a mission, I guess, of your own, of sorts. What made you decide to produce this documentary and to tell Tom Little's story?
Well, I was living in Albany a couple of years ago when the story broke, and it was an international story because the team that Tom was leading was it was the largest massacre of foreign aid workers in the entire Afghan conflict, Afghanistan war. And so basically it was an international story, but it had a strong local hook because Tom was from Albany. And I was amazed that I had never heard of this guy, and neither had most other people. And so the media was instantly all over this story, but they were tending to concentrate on the last 5 minutes of Tom Little's life, which was, his untimely death in Nuristan. And my thought was, they kept on saying in these news reports over and over again, he was there for over 33 years. I'm thinking, well, what were the other 33 years all about? And trying to tell a story that was somehow bigger than those last 5 minutes. So that was the genesis of the story. And then I approached Libby about it. I had waited about a year because I felt that it would be a very sensitive issue, of course. We kind of had a number of exchanges back and forth, and she warmed to the idea over time, and we finally decided to try to tell the story.
Beyond the story of him being among 10 people killed by the Taliban,
right.
Humanitarian aid workers killed, what was his story? How did he end up in Afghanistan, and why is his story important?
Well, he grew up in Kinderhook, New York. His father was an eye doctor, and Tom really could have inherited the family business, and it's actually what his dad wanted him to do. But Tom got involved with an organization that was helping hippies in Afghanistan in the 1970s. There was this Silk Road that stretched from Europe to India, and so you had all these hippies who were sort of seeking enlightenment along this trail headed to, spiritual gurus in India and whatnot. They would wind up in Kabul, and it became sort of a bottleneck where these kids would get busted on drug charges, they would get sick, their money or their passports would be stolen, so they couldn't go any further, and there was a need to have somebody there helping these thousands of Westerners who were there, which you can imagine the context of Afghanistan, which at that time and still is a very conservative country, to have sort of these, people on psychedelics, in the streets and whatnot. So there was sort of a need to help these people. And he felt drawn to go over there and help. He was actually invited by somebody who had done some mission work over there to help these kids. And eventually, the Afghan government got sick of all these hippies, and they started denying travel visas through the country. So the work dried up. But Tom, because his father had been an eye doctor, Tom had some limited experience grinding lenses, doing some very basic eye care stuff. And there was an eye hospital in the country, and he began volunteering for them and finally transitioned over full-time when there wasn't a need to do this other work.
So Tom and Libby lived there for more than 30 years. They raised their family there, their 3 daughters there. Yep. Were they happy there?
I know for a fact Tom absolutely loved Afghanistan. I know that he felt that the U.S. was his first home, but he fell in love with the country. And it is, for the short period of time that I was there, I can completely understand why. It is breathtaking. It's an intriguing place, and in other senses, it's like the Wild West. You can really sort of write your own ticket there. So there's this sort of intoxication I think you could get with that country, and really feel a sort of freedom that you couldn't have anywhere else to do these sorts of things. And when you see the story of his life, it plays out like a Hollywood movie. The things that he did, the close calls with death, you get the sense that, he really became hooked on it.
When you say it was a Wild West, did he and his family have to worry about their safety?
There were so many close calls. I mean, there was a time that Thom was pulled off a bus because he refused to let the female nurse that he was with, who was an Afghan, be taken by the Taliban. The Taliban had set up a checkpoint, had identified this woman, and said, she needs to come with us. And Thom tried to get off the bus and argue with them, and they clubbed him, dragged him behind a building, and fired shots. And his family is on the bus, watching their father get clubbed, dragged behind this building, and then they hear shots, and they thought, that's it. My dad is dead. And a few minutes later, he came out holding his head, white as a sheet. Apparently they had this argument, and he had just simply asked for some water, and that broke the tension, and then he was able to talk with them. And that's sort of indicative of his whole life, really, is that he was all about having conversations with people, finding connections with people, finding common ground with people, even to the point where he was revered by many people who were in the Taliban. And you mentioned that the Taliban claimed responsibility. They did, but then there were other factions of the Taliban who said we had nothing to do with this. And there's a bit of ambiguity still to this day, even with the claims of responsibility, who actually did it, because he was really revered.
Were brushes like that more a rarity than the norm? Was he able to do a lot of good work in his time there?
Yeah, I mean, there are eye projects all over the country that bear the stamp of what he did, and I know from talking with his family that he experienced deep self-doubt about whether or not he was making any kind of lasting impact. But when we went there, we saw 2 facilities that had just opened up that they were his babies. There were a lot of other people who worked on these things, but when people talk about them, they say this was Thom's dream.
Were there times that his family, both his family living with him there, his daughters, Libby, his family back here in the States, were worried about his safety and thought, you've done great work there, but it's time to get out, it's time to come home, it's too dangerous?
I just talked recently with one of Thom's daughters, and they've been very hesitant to be involved in the project because there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of question about what was the perspective of the film and what were we trying to say with it. But one of Thom's daughters, really sort of confided in me. She said, I thought he was there a year too long. There was a point at which things sort of began to unravel towards the end there, and he was tired. He was over 60 years old, which is old. I mean, Afghanistan's a hard country. It's not easy to continue to operate at the pace he was going. So she felt it was time for him to come home, and it was just horrible timing what happened in the end.
It sounds as if his brother raised the same question. His brother, Fred, is well known to people in the Plattsburgh area. He lived here for many years, was a radio disc jockey at 2 radio stations in town, and then worked at Wyeth up in Rouse's Point. He seemed to raise that point as well, that there were a number of times when they were asking, what are you doing there? Is it time to get out and come home?
Yeah, and that was a question that everybody had here. I mean, back in the 70s, people thought Afghanistan was somewhere in Africa. They didn't even know what the country was, and Thom would come home and tell them these stories, and it was sort of mind-boggling. Like, really, why are you doing this when you have the option? Your dad wants you to take over the family business. You're a talented person. You could write your own ticket here. And Libby at several points said, there were times I wanted to get out, but on the day we would try to leave, and she said, if I told him we had to go, he would have gone. I mean, he wasn't crazy reckless like that. He didn't have a total disregard for his family. But she said Thom would just say, well, okay, we can leave, but will you just do rounds with me at the hospital? Will you just come and see people with me? And she said it worked every single time. She would see the Afghan people and realize, if we leave, that's it. We're walking out on these people who cannot leave. They have no options. And so she stuck it out for years and years and years. And there were a few points where she had to get out and rest, but I mean, Thom saw it through, for sure.
Are you focusing specifically on Thom's story, or are you looking at some of the broader issues in Afghanistan?
It's grown a little bit. I mean, I first got into this wanting to know Thom's story, but then when the story began to unfold, you realize it's so much bigger than just this one person, this one Westerner, that there are over 30 million Afghans who wake up every day and that's home for them, So I think the film, not to use a pun, but Thom is an optometrist. I want to use him as a lens for Westerners to see a bigger story about Afghanistan. I talked to people who said, Thom would have hated this film. He would have been mortified to have a film made about him, except if he thought it was doing something good for Afghans. And they said, and then I think he would have bought in, and he would have permitted it. He wouldn't have loved it, but he would have permitted it. And so, I mean, I think we do want to talk about the needs of Afghans in a humanitarian sense, the role of aid work being done in that country. What is the prospects for the future? I don't want to make it a political film, but I want to have it be a film that allows people to see Afghans the way that Thom saw Afghans. And I think that would be of incredible benefit for us, because we don't hear those stories here. We get the pictures on the news, which make it look like it's a never-ending cascade of rockets, and you know, it's simply not the only story.
Were you nervous about making the trip?
Yeah, I mean, so basically what happened is Libby said, you can't tell this story from upstate New York because our lives were there. And I don't know if that was a tactic to try to make me go away at that point, or if she was really serious. And you know, we kind of worked on some different promos. We did some fundraising for the film to get the funds to do it. And she said, okay, let's go then. And it was so surreal. I mean, for her to actually be willing to do this and to go. And of course, I told my family members about it, and they said, really, is this a good idea? And I went back to Libby and I said, is this really a good idea? I've got a lot of people asking questions. I'm pretty nervous myself. And she said, it's a great idea. I said, really, it's a great idea? And she said, yeah, because it's always so much worse over here than it is when you get there. The perception, your imagination of what the place is like is so much worse than the place itself, and I found that to be completely true. I mean, there was a lot of military presence, no U.S. military presence perceivably, but a strong Afghan military presence. There, you definitely got the sense that there was the potential for violence, because these people wouldn't be here on every street corner and driving around on, you know, Ford Ranger pickup trucks with machine gun mounts on the back if bad things didn't happen here. But, you know, we didn't witness the sort of chaos that you can imagine when you're there.
When and where will the documentary premiere?
It'll premiere on Mountain Lake PBS, and the timeline for that is sometime early next year, 2014. I'd like to kind of have it come out around the same time that there'll be a lot of discussion about the U.S. troop withdrawal, and I hope that the film can be of some value and raising the level of conversation about the future of aid work in Afghanistan.
Great, Dan Swinton. Thank you very much for taking the time.
All right, thank you.